Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to be talking about one of the finest, prettiest, mightiest, strongest Skaven of them all, Chief Warlock Engineer of Clan Skryre, Ikit Claw. Just look at him. What a handsome lad he is. Giant, monstrous mechanical arms, complete with finger knives, check. Glowing things at the end of his massive warp halberd that also has a smaller halberd attached to it, absolutely. Huge pistol bolted at his waist, yup. And of course, metal skull mask. A more handsome ratkin you will never behold, and I'll tell you that right now. And you can hardly even tell that he's a semi-crippled burn victim beneath all of that armor. Ah, yes. Good old Ikit. He's a character from all the way back in Skaven 4th edition, the very first proper army book the Skavens received. They were mentioned in Warhammer armies all the way back in 3rd as well, but 4th was when they really started taking off and developed, well, what would eventually become the Skaven we know and love today. And frankly, the 4th edition Skaven army book is still the absolute best book the Skaven have ever received. It was Warhammer at the very height of its Warhammerness, and by God did I love it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I still have that army book lying around here somewhere, though considerably worse off for wear. I read that damn thing until the pages started falling out. Now, poor old Ikit didn't get quite the attention he deserved all the way back then, since the book was primarily concerned with establishing the Skaven as a full-fledged race rather than focusing on individual characters. But of course, that is something that we can absolutely remedy today. And even all the way back then, he did get a little bit of fluff, I remember. For example, Ikit Claw was the Warlock engineer credited with the invention of the mighty Doom Wheel. And no, we're going to use the old version. The new one is too meh. I don't like the new Doom Wheel. It looks like it could actually, function. That's not the point of Clan Skryre. Absolutely not. But we are deviating somewhat from the point, are we not? So let us return back to Ikit Claw, one of the handsomest little furry creatures to have ever singed his whiskers in the massive warp fortress beneath Skaven Blight. Like all of his fellow ratmen, Ikit Claw had a clear vision of what his future was supposed to be. He knew, intrinsically, as all Skaven do, that he was the only worthwhile individual in the entire race, and that he would inevitably, eventually, be elevated to his rightful place above all other Skaven. Now, for 99.9% of Skaven, this turns out to be a dangerous delusion that usually ends up getting them eaten by one of the myriad predators that find the Skaven to be just on the right side of crunchy with a good crust to them. Unfortunately, much of Ikit's early life is lost to myth and legend. Unsurprisingly in all reality, because as mentioned, most Skaven do believe that it is their right to stand at the very top of society, but the overwhelming majority of them never even manage to grab hold of the first rung of that ladder. Never mind getting within licking distance of the top. What we do know, though, is that the young Ikit Claw went on globe-trotting adventures across most, if indeed not pretty much all, of the Warhammer world. And not just the old world, mind you, but trips all the way over to the new world in Lustria, and to the Dragon Empire of Cathay and faraway Nippon. This ability to travel more or less at will across the Skaven Under-Empire suggests that even as a tiny little furred creature making its way out of the lowest reaches of Clan Skryre's massive warrens, Ikit's tinkering must have been very successful and very desirable. Few are the ratmen indeed who ever even see the outside of their birth warren. Never mind this citizen of the world nonsense that Ikit clearly had going. So he must have had plenty of warp tokens, and the only way I can imagine someone like Ikit acquiring them would be by making all manners of interesting trinkets and selling them to the highest bidder. And taking into consideration the usual proclivities of the Skaven Under Empire, I'm imagining that his skills were primarily aimed towards the crafting of various forms of weaponry, with which one petty warlord or crime lord, or simply just a random Skaven, could use to turn somebody that he didn't like into ever so much bloody pudding scattered across the floor. For whilst, of course, the Skaven Under Empire is expansive in the extreme, traversing it is neither easy nor cheap, nor safe for that matter. Merely just navigating the seemingly endless tunnels and countless side warrens without becoming hopelessly lost would take quite a bit of green. In this case, the green refers to warp tokens, the Skaven's equivalent of money, essentially. And food, money, essentially. And food, and fuel, and energy, and, well, everything in between, really. Skaven society runs off Warpstone, and so an entrepreneuring young Warlock engineer would have to have in his possession a lot of these little tokens to ensure his safe travels. And that, of course, is only the getting there bit. Ikit had far grander ambitions than merely visiting these far-flung places, of course. He wished to learn everything there was to know about magic. Not as an esoterical, noncy-poncy silly thing like making sparks appear or tossing fireballs, anything like that. He viewed magic like what it truly was, a form of science, a force of nature that could be bridled and placed under the control of the Horned Rat's chosen people. And this is a very important distinction to make as well, for whilst Ikit is often mentioned or referred to as a sorcerer, or magic caster, a wizard of some kind, this is only partially true. Yes, he does utilize magic, and yes, he has a near encyclopedic understanding of the various races' spells and how they perceive the winds of magic and how they utilize them, but he is far more so a scientist of these winds of magic than he is, say, a bright wizard, or a lore master of Hoeth, or a dwarven rune priest, or any else of these myriad different forms of interacting with chaos, which is, of course, at the heart of all magic in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. A fact that Ikit perhaps understands better than literally anyone else, for in reality, only the oldest and most experienced of Slan mage priests could possibly hope to even begin rivaling Ikit's sheer level of research and knowledge. Since, again, he didn't merely just travel to these places, he broke into their secret areas and stole all of their fancy stuff, their tomes of knowledge, their magical artifacts, and on more than one occasions, their actual wizards and priests as well, who were then brought back home to Ikit's labs for up-close study sessions. Now you might think that holy men and wizened old magic users would hold on to their secrets quite dearly, and certainly wouldn't give them over to a giant monstrous Skaven thing that has dragged you out of your bed in the middle of the night, tied you to a chair, and is now informing you as to the precise usage of the Warpstone-tipped manual drill he's holding in clawed hands right now. But, as that image already probably paints, Ikit can be remarkably persuasive when he wants to. This is not to say, though, that Ikit is merely any old copyrat. No, far from it. Again, this is the key distinction between somebody that understands the nature of magic and some old fool who simply recites spells or old rituals from dusty books. Ikit understands the core component parts, and is therefore able to think to himself, okay, if spell A does this and spell B does this, then if I can combine the two, then I get to reaction C, which might just be infinitely more interesting than either A or B by themselves. This obviously required a huge amount of experimentation, which would have demanded yet further funding. And there is no such thing as a joint research grant within the Skaven Under-Empire. No sane Warlock engineer would ever lift so much as a clawed little toe to help one of his competitors. That would simply just be silly. Not to mention poor form as well. If you want to learn one of your competitors' secrets, then the only truly Skaven way to do that is to break into his workshop in the middle of the night and take them. The good old-fashioned way. Though there are those, of course, which stand above the fray and above the competition, and that may have a great deal to earn from having an innovative young Warlock engineer at his beck and call. And one of these was Lord Warlock Morskitar, the head honcho of Clan Skryre. There were none in the clan with more influence and more wealth than he, and through Ikit's various inventions he drew his beneficent gaze upon him. Now, this was a very dangerous thing indeed, because when the ruler of a clan sees a young upstart, there is essentially only two choices available to him. One, crush the youngling's skull beneath a clawed foot before he gets too much in the way of influence and becomes a threat, or B, he's too useful to kill, and therefore he is to be taken under the patronage of the lord in question. Luckily for Ikit, he had proven himself extremely worthwhile so far, and so he got to go with the B course. This was going to turn out to be a very wise decision from Lord Morskitar, and would eventually see him as the second most powerful individual on the Council of 13. But this elevated position still lay quite a bit in the future. Whilst Morskitar was sponsoring Ikit's various experiments and his travels across the world, Ikit developed, amongst other things, as we know, the Skaven Doom Wheel, one of his more, huge and awesome looking inventions, absolutely. He also is rumoured to have had more than a hand or two in the development of many other forms of Skaven weaponry as well, though during these experiments he did occasionally have a handful of, failures here and there. Ikit burned down more than his fair share of laboratories over the course of his career. The most famous mishap, of course, being the one that singed the flesh and fur off his skull and reduced his left arm to a withered, burned wreck of a limb. He compensated, of course, and this little mishap never even once discouraged him from continuing his adventures in the fields of science. What is a left arm, after all, when compared to the near limitless possibilities of crafting ever larger explosive devices? And hey, everything's got a silver lining, right? Well, He had been working on a mechanical suit of armor, and seeing as he had almost completely managed to cripple himself with his own experiments, and had to live in agonizing pain for the foreseeable future, his iron frame armor came in quite handy. Not only is his arm, of course, a massive mechanical claw which houses a small warp fire thrower, by the way, but the frame also enhances the rest of his body's functions. He is far stronger than any Skaven has any right to be, and is able to wield his magic glaive, the Storm Demon, with ferocious speed and power. Additionally, the iron frame provides a considerable degree of protection, both against more mundane threats like blades, knives, and venomed assassin's daggers, and also arcane dangers. Ikit Claw knows everything there is to know about magic, and he certainly understands the joy of turning an enemy into a merrily dancing marionette engulfed in warp flames. He knows enough about that fate, in particular, by the way, to wish to avoid it ever happening again, and so he worked plentiful magic wards into his armor. In many ways, Ikit Claw today is essentially a miniature walking laboratory, containing all of his more successful and, relatively speaking, safe inventions. Amongst which, by the way, I can only assume is a repository of his revolutionary hair regrowth formula. Because, as you may remember, during one of his more enthusiastic experiments, he zapped himself to the point of scorching both the flesh and fur of most of his body, including his head and face. That's why he's wearing the fancy iron mask. And yet, these days, Ikit is sporting a fine, illustrious hide of white fur. Which raises some questions in and of itself. White-furred Skavens are few and far between, and essentially only exist within the ranks of the Grey Seers or the Council's albino guards. And Ikit, of course, is neither of those things. Nor do you have to be a white or grey-furred Skaven to wield magic. The secretive Clan Eshin, for example, possess their own sorcerers, and Lord Skrolk of Clan Pestilence is living, at least in a certain fashion, proof that yes, indeed, even the more normally coloured multitudes of Skavendom can wield the arcane arts. In my humble opinion, the reason why he is now a white-furred Skaven is because whoever did his redesign back in the 7th edition either didn't know the significance behind white fur, or thought that only white-furred Skaven could cast magic. Either or, it was a little bit of a fuck-up, and I think that is probably the most likely and lore-friendly explanation, because, you see, the Grey Seers do not like competition, and if, indeed, Ikit was born with white fur, he would invariably have been introduced into their circles. They would not have allowed a white-furred Skaven, particularly not one with such a ferocious hunger for magic knowledge, toddle about uncontrolled. To do that, you are either going to have to be an extremely secretive caster, as in the case of Clan Eshin, or a very powerful one, as in the case of Lord Skrolk. As it turns out, if you have the ability to turn anyone who so much as touches you into a leper with minutes left to live, then, well, you have a fair bit of protection against anyone fucking with you. But arguments over fur color aside, let us then move on to the grand rise of Clan Skryre. And, most importantly of all, the moment when Morskitar's bet and his faith, quote-unquote, in Ikit paid off in truckloads. And like all good Skaven stories, this one starts with a pinch of political intrigue. For you see, Clan Pestilence, after the absolutely rip-roaring success of the Black Death, which had almost managed to turn the entirety of the Empire into one vast Skaven over-Empire domain, Pestilence tried to repeat their success with the Red Pox and the invasion of Bretonnia. But unfortunately for Pestilence, the pox proved to be far lesser of a malady than the Black Death. For comparison, the Black Death ravaged the Empire from 600 to 1111 Imperial calendar, during which time the only thing that stopped the Skaven from taking over the entirety of the human lands was, as usual, their own bickering and infighting, whereas the Red Pox only lasted from 1786 to 1812 of the Imperial calendar, and ended with an embarrassing and total defeat for the forces of the Ratmen. Over the course of the next 40-odd years, this failure saw Clan Pestilence position within the Council of 13 significantly weakened, and many of their enemies, they were all too happy to take advantage of that. Clan Pestilence had never been one for creating allies where there were opportunities to make enemies instead, or corpses preferably, and they were about to get a big old dose of their own medicine. It all came to a head in 1850, when the Council of 13 was sufficiently split for those in opposition to Clan Pestilence to demand that the lords of Clan Pestilence relinquish their seats upon the council and abandon their positions of power, which, somewhat unsurprisingly, they refused to do. This led to a massive and sudden blossoming of violence within Skavenblight, the capital of the Under-Empire, as both parties, frankly, had seen this coming and had prepared their armies to take advantage of the chaos. As the violence continued to ebb back and forth with the albino storm vermin of the council fighting in the streets against the plague monks of Pestilence, Clan Skryre withdrew into their own armoured compound within Skavenblight, where Morskitar and Ikit were preparing their own countermoves. When Ikit was well and truly ready, having marshalled all of his considerable military might, he led a huge horde of Skryre out from their compounds with weapon teams, Jeziles, doom wheels, and warp fire throwers at the fore. He burned, blasted, and ratata'd a path through all opposition, eventually claiming the council chambers for Skryre and his lord Morskitar, who then immediately, of course, declared himself the Lord of Skavenblight and ordered all the warring parties to step down and accept his authority. Unfortunately, Lord Morskitar had left it a little bit too late. He had undoubtedly hoped to strike like a lightning bolt from a clear sky, sweep away all opposition, and declare himself the undisputed ruler of the capital of Skavendom. Unfortunately, by the time he saw the opportunity to strike, most of the council had already fled to their own strongpoints, and so whilst Morskitar was undeniably in control of Skavenblight, all of his political opposition, the very ones he was relying on either murdering or threatening into supporting him, were all fled, and soon launched their own rival claims of true legitimacy. What continued then was the Second Skaven Civil War, which was going to rage for nigh on 400 years. And if left to their own devices, the little furred fiends may have carried on with their civil war for all eternity. It only stopped with the direct intervention of the great horned rat himself. But this is, of course, of little real consequence to Ikit Claw. From his perspective, this was all rather fantastic. With Lord Morskitar in command of Skaven Blight, that meant that Ikit had every opportunity to undergo some rather drastic extensions of his laboratory, and he was put in charge of growing the Warpstone forges beneath the Skaven capital. Eventually, what had started out as relatively modest Skryre warrens grew into some of the largest research yards in the entirety of Skavendom. Now, one might have thought that Skaven Blight would have learned its lesson after almost having been destroyed by Skaven ingenuity in the past, but it's remarkable what a change of leadership can do, especially a change of leadership headed up by an army of warp fire throwers. Regardless, Ikit now had all the money in the world, and all of the slaves to test his new inventions upon as well, and made leaps and bounds in Skaven weapon technology, improving upon and refining many of their more lethal inventions, until finally, of course, coming up with the dual crowning jewels in Ikit's crown. One of which is the rather infamous Doomsphere, and the other, the Morskitar engine. Let us begin with the sphere, shall we? The Doomsphere was essentially a very, very, very large bomb, more akin to an atom bomb in all due reality than merely a big old bunch of TNT. And to further emphasize the destructive effect of the Doomsphere, it was also strategically placed on a major fault line beneath the Dwarven Mountains. If it hadn't been for the brave intervention of a dwarven engineer by the name of Klarak Bronzenhammer, Ikit would have detonated the device and caused what remained of the Dwarf Empire to simply just disappear into the ground, essentially, as world-shattering earthquakes would have rocked the World Edge Mountains once more, like during the time of woe. And seeing as that event almost crushed the Dwarf Empire at the height of its power, I think to say that the successful detonation of the Doomsphere would probably have finished the job. As for the Morskitar engine, well, it was essentially a my penis is larger than your penis move from Ikit Claw. You see, the Grey Seas had come up with a plan to pull Morslib, the massive moon of the Warhammer world said to be made out of pure Warpstone, closer to the planet's surface. They reckoned that this would make their own powers considerably greater, and that it would be an act that would greatly please the Horned Rats. It would also, in all due likelihood, have led to rampant mutations across the entire Warhammer world and plunged the entire godforsaken place into chaos once more, which is why the Slan mage priests tried so very damn hard to stop it, though in the end they did fail. This was of course a momentous achievement, something that seemed set to cement the Grey Sea's positions of power over Skavendom for all eternity, and so Ikit decided to build the largest cannon the world has ever seen and fire it at the moon. And hey, he succeeded, beyond his own wildest imagination. Unfortunately, Ikit's plan was apparently to smash a nice big chunk of the moon loose, allowing ginormous Warpstone meteorites to hammer down into the Earth's surface, and then he could rush over to claim them. This would be like, knocking a few hundred 1,000 tons of gold loose off the moon, presuming the moon was made out of solid gold, and then rushing over to grab it. It would have been rather useful, to put it mildly. Unfortunately, Ikit had outdone himself, and instead of simply just blasting a chunk out of the moon, well, the chunk was a little bit too large. And if it weren't for Mazdamundi and Lord Croak of the Lizardmen sacrificing themselves to stop it, the chunk would probably have led to the utter annihilation of the entire world. A wasted effort, if you ask me, considering the world ended shortly thereafter regardless, but hey, I suppose we needed something for the two old wizened Slan mage priests to do as well during the apocalypse. Meanwhile, Ikit, of course, was just fine and still resolutely determined to demonstrate the size of his winker by infiltrating and blowing apart Nagasha's grand, indestructible Black Pyramid. Well, indestructible only up until the point of Ikit pressing the boom button on his remote detonator, that is. And so, after nearly having single-handedly destroyed the Dwarven Empire, after having built and fired a cannon at the moon that almost destroyed the Earth, and after having blown chunks out of an indestructible temple structure, what was Ikit Claw's reward, you ask? How was he transported into Age of Shitmar after the end of the end times? It wasn't. After all of that, Ikit Claw's model is today used to represent nothing more than a standard run-of-the-mill Warlock engineer, whilst one of his most aggressive competitors, Tankwell, may the horned rat ever piss on his soul, has not only a model, but his very own rules in Age of Sigmar as well. I can almost hear Ikit spinning in his grave from here, but hopefully the coming resurgence of Warhammer Fantasy will reintroduce this lovely clawed fiend, and hopefully they'll fix his fur color in the process. That'd be neat. With that, I'll wrap up this lore video on Ikit Claw, Chief Warlock of Clan Skryre, and creator of not one, but 2 Doomsday devices. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching. If you liked the video, please do consider sharing it around, liking and subscribing. Oh, and whilst I'm shilling, hit the fucking bell as well. Because God knows, YouTube isn't going to tell you about my videos if you don't. Have a good day.